Matilda by Roald Dahl. Read by Kate Winslet. The Reader of Books. It's a funny thing about mothers and fathers. Even when their own child is the most disgusting little blister you could ever imagine, they still think that he or she is wonderful. It's the way of the world. Occasionally, one comes across parents who take the opposite line, who show no interest at all in their children, and these, of course, are far worse than the doting ones. Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood were two such parents. They had a son called Michael and a daughter called Matilda, and the parents looked upon Matilda in particular as nothing more than a scab. It is bad enough when parents treat ordinary children as though they were scabs and bunions, but it becomes somehow a lot worse when the child in question is extraordinary, and by that I mean sensitive and brilliant. Matilda was both of these things, but above all, she was brilliant. Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood were both so gormless and so wrapped up in their own silly little lives that they failed to notice anything unusual about their daughter. By the age of 1.5, her speech was perfect, and she knew as many words as most grown-ups. The parents, instead of applauding her, called her a noisy chatterbox and told her sharply that small girls should be seen and not heard. By the time she was 3, Matilda had taught herself to read by studying newspapers and magazines that lay around the house. At the age of 4, she could read fast and well, and she naturally began hankering after books. "Daddy," she said, "do you think you could buy me a book?" "A book?" he said. "What do you want a flaming book for?" "To read, Daddy." "What's wrong with the telly, for heaven's sake?" Nearly every weekday afternoon, Matilda was left alone in the house. Her brother, 5 years older than her, went to school. Her father went to work, and her mother went out playing bingo in a town 8 miles away. On the afternoon of the day when her father had refused to buy her a book, Matilda set out all by herself to walk to the public library in the village. When she arrived, she introduced herself to the librarian, Mrs. Phelps. "Where are the children's books, please?" Matilda asked. "They're over there on those lower shelves," Mrs. Phelps told her. "Would you like me to help you find a nice one with lots of pictures in it?" "No, thank you," Matilda said. "I'm sure I can manage." From then on, every afternoon, as soon as her mother had left for bingo, Matilda would toddle down to the library. This allowed her 2 glorious hours, sitting quietly by herself in a cosy corner, devouring one book after another. When she had read every single children's book in the place, she started wandering round in search of something else. Mrs. Phelps, who had been watching her with fascination for the past few weeks, now got up from her desk and went over to her. "I'm wondering what to read next," Matilda said. "I've finished all the children's books." "You mean you've looked at the pictures?" "Yes, but I've read the books as well." Mrs. Phelps was stunned. "Exactly how old are you, Matilda?" she asked. 4 years and 3 months, Matilda said. Mrs. Phelps was more stunned than ever, but she had the sense not to show it. "What sort of a book would you like to read next?" she asked. Matilda said, "I would like a really good one that grown-ups read, a famous one. I don't know any names." Mrs. Phelps looked along the shelves, taking her time. "Try this," she said at last. "It's very famous and very good." "Great Expectations," Matilda read, "by Charles Dickens. I'd love to try it." Over the next few afternoons, Mrs. Phelps could hardly take her eyes from the small girl sitting for hour after hour in the big armchair at the far end of the room with the book on her lap. Within a week, Matilda had finished Great Expectations, which in that edition contained 411 pages. "I loved it," she said to Mrs. Phelps. "Has Mr. Dickens written any others?" "A great number," said the astounded Mrs. Phelps. "Did you know that public libraries like this allow you to borrow books and take them home?" "I didn't know that," Matilda said. "Could I do it?" "Of course," Mrs. Phelps said. "You can take more than one if you wish." From then on, Matilda would visit the library only once a week in order to take out new books and return the old ones. Her own small bedroom now became her reading room, and there she would sit and read most afternoons, often with a mug of hot chocolate beside her. The books transported her into new worlds and introduced her to amazing people who lived exciting lives. She travelled all over the world while sitting in her little room in an English village. Mr. Wormwood, the Great Car Dealer. Matilda's parents owned quite a nice house with 3 bedrooms upstairs, while on the ground floor there was a dining room and a living room and a kitchen. Her father was a dealer in second-hand cars, and it seemed he did pretty well at it. "Sawdust," he would say proudly, "is one of the great secrets of my success, and it costs me nothing. I get it free from the sawmill." "I don't see how sawdust can help you to sell second-hand cars, Daddy." "That's because you're an ignorant little twit," the father said. His speech was never very delicate, but Matilda was used to it. She also knew that he liked to boast, and she would egg him on shamelessly. "You must be very clever to find a use for something that costs nothing," she said. "I wish I could do it." "You couldn't," the father said. "You're too stupid, but I don't mind telling young Mike here about it, seeing he'll be joining me in the business one day." Ignoring Matilda, he turned to his son and said, "I'm always glad to buy a car when some fool has been crashing the gears so badly they're all worn out and rattle like mad. I get it cheap. Then all I do is mix a lot of sawdust with the oil in the gearbox and it runs as sweet as a nut." "But that's dishonest, Daddy," Matilda said. "It's cheating." "No one ever got rich being honest," the father said. "Customers are there to be diddled." Mr. Wormwood was a small, ratty-looking man whose front teeth stuck out underneath a thin, ratty moustache. "Now take mileage, for instance," he went on. "Anyone who's buying a second-hand car, first thing he wants to know is how many miles it's done, right?" "Right," the son said. "So, I buy an old dump that's got about 150,000 miles on the clock. I get it cheap. But no one's going to buy it with a mileage like that, are they? So what do? I use my brains, laddie. That's what I do." "How?" young Michael asked, fascinated. He seemed to have inherited his father's love of crookery.